All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Ukraine's still a hot topic, and we've got some really thought-provoking material to go through today. Seems like there are two big things we should focus on.
Okay, yeah.
First, this whole thing with the U.S. and Russia possibly taking the lead in peace talks, kind of interesting.
Definitely.
And then that whole incident with the Russian plane that went down, so many unanswered questions.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation for sure. A lot going on.
Definitely complicated. It feels like we could be seeing like a power shift happening right in front of us,
Absolutely. That piece you send over about Trump and Putin's meeting happening at the same time as Zelensky's urging Europe to step up their role, it's pretty significant.
Yeah. What struck me was that security analyst, what was his name? Mikhail Smetana from, I think it was the University of Karlova.
Right.
He suggests that Trump pushing for peace so hard, it might be more about his image back home than anything else.
Yeah, Smetana even pulls a quote from one of Trump's recent speeches, and it uses language that sounds a lot like his 2016 campaign, almost like he's trying to project that strong leader image again.
Trying to look tough for the voters. Interesting.
It's a strategy for sure.
And it makes you think about Europe being kind of sidelined in all this, even though they've got the economic power and they're right there next to the conflict.
Yeah, it's almost like we're seeing those Cold War dynamics play out again, with the U.S. and Russia in the forefront.
Exactly. And Smetana says a big reason for that is because the European Union, well, they just don't have a unified foreign policy or a strong defense strategy.
It makes it tough for them to act quickly and decisively in a situation like this. They just don't have that unified front.
So it makes it easier for leaders like Trump and Putin, who both seem to be into that strongman kind of leadership, to just take the reins.
Exactly. Smetana even goes so far as to predict that they'll be the main negotiators in those initial peace talks, with Europe left out of the picture, at least at first.
But Smetana also suggests that, and this is where it gets really interesting, that this might be part of a bigger U.S. strategy.
Right, like the U.S. is okay with brokering the peace deal, but then wants to hand off the long-term responsibility of keeping the peace part to Europe.
Maybe with peacekeeping forces or border control, but without a huge U.S. presence.
Yeah, that's the picture Smetana paints. Of course, as he points out, international politics are, pretty unpredictable.
Right, always shifting.
We could see some unexpected power moves, new alliances popping up, and that would just throw a wrench in everything.
Totally. Okay, so we've got this potential power struggle brewing, and then on top of that, we have this tragic incident with the Russian IL-76 transport plane going down in Belgorod, Russia, right near the Ukrainian border.
Yeah.
Russia's saying it was carrying 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war and that Ukraine shot it down, even calling it a terrorist act. But Ukraine, they haven't exactly confirmed or denied anything.
It's murky. And there's that unsettling detail from one of the reports you sent where Ukraine suggests the plane could have been mistaken for a military cargo plane based on what it had been used for in the past.
So maybe a case of mistaken identity.
Possibly. There's also conflicting info on whether Russia even told Ukraine that there were prisoners on board.
Oh, wow. So many layers to this. It's got to be so hard for the families of those missing prisoners just not knowing.
Absolutely devastating. And you sent over that story about Sofia Sobolyeva, who thinks her father was on that plane. Just imagine the not knowing, the waiting. It's just heartbreaking.
It really is. And then there's Zelensky calling for investigations by both Ukrainian intelligence and international groups. But it's unclear if anyone even knows who the victims are.
Yeah, even though Russian media put out this list of 65 names, Ukraine hasn't been able to confirm if those people were actually on the plane or even if they died.
And the whole thing with the remains, the Red Cross supervised the transfer of some remains back in November 2024, but they didn't actually get involved in identifying them.
Right, so Russia's claiming there are the remains from the IL-76, but it's still unverified.
Wow. It's such a messy situation.
It really is. And the lack of transparency is a major issue. You even pointed out this Ukrainian NGO, the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and they're doing their own investigation because there's just not enough official information out there.
It's like everyone's operating in the dark.
Yeah, it really shows just how much we still don't know about what happened.
A lot of unknowns, for sure.
Definitely a lot to unpack here.
Yeah. So we've got this potential power vacuum developing, with Europe hesitant to take charge, and the U.S. may be content to let them deal with the fallout while they focus on other things. So the question is, who steps into that void?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's what makes this whole situation so unpredictable. We might be seeing the geopolitical landscape completely reshaped, and the effects of that could go way beyond Ukraine.
It makes you wonder, If the EU isn't at the negotiating table, what does that mean for their influence on the world stage, especially when it comes to issues of war and peace?
It's a huge question mark, and it almost feels like there's this assumption that Europe will just, like, passively accept whatever the US and Russia decide. But is that really realistic?
I mean, won't there be pushback from European countries,
Yeah.
especially ones closer to the conflict? And what about Ukraine itself? They're caught right in the middle of all of this, desperate for the war to end.
Right. If they're not even part of the negotiations, what control do they really have over their own future?
That's a really good point. And Smetana, he seems to suggest that this whole situation could be a wake-up call for Europe.
Yeah.
Like they need to get their act together, present a united front, and make some decisive moves if they want to be taken seriously on the world stage.
Yeah, otherwise they risk becoming, well, kind of irrelevant, but their fate decided by superpowers like the US and Russia.
And for Ukraine, that's got to be a terrifying thought. It really highlights how complicated conflict resolution is, trying to balance the interests of these global powers with the needs of the country actually being torn apart by the war.
It's a tough balancing act.
Mhm.
And then you layer on the tragedy of the downed plane, and it brings up these really unsettling questions about, like, accountability and transparency in conflict zones.
Yeah, you can't just sweep those things under the rug.
Yeah.
And amidst all this geopolitical maneuvering, it's easy to lose sight of the human lives that are being impacted.
Exactly. The lack of clarity around the incident is super troubling. It just underscores the need for thorough, independent investigations to figure out what really happened and hold those responsible accountable, especially with those American sources saying that a US-supplied Patriot missile might have been involved.
Yeah, that adds a whole other dimension to it, raises questions about like the fog of war, misidentification, and unintended consequences.
It's a lot to grapple with. We can't let ourselves get so caught up in the geopolitical chess game that we forget about the human cost.
Absolutely. The families of those missing prisoners, they're dealing with this incredible uncertainty and grief. And even if a peace agreement is reached, the scars from this conflict, they're going to last for years.
It's a sobering thought, and it just emphasizes how important transparency and open dialogue are. Without that, you can't establish the facts, you can't learn from the mistakes, and you can't move towards a more peaceful future.
Very well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think we've unpacked some of the key issues pretty well, but there's always more to uncover.
Oh, absolutely.
What stands out to you as the most pressing question or the biggest concern moving forward?
You know, what really sticks with me and maybe worries me a bit is this whole idea of Europe's role, or lack thereof, in shaping the future of Ukraine and, the stability of the entire region. If they're not involved in the peace talks, if they're not actively trying to shape the process, what does that mean for their long-term security? Will they end up just pawns in this bigger game being played by the US and Russia?
That's a pretty thought-provoking question, and it makes you think about what kind of Europe will emerge from all of this. Will they finally get on the same page with a common defense and foreign policy, or will they stay fragmented and vulnerable? It feels like we're at this crucial point in history, and the choices made in the next few months or even years, they'll have a massive impact on Europe, Ukraine, and the whole global order.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating and honestly a little bit scary. We're seeing a potential reshaping of the geopolitical landscape in real time, and the consequences could last for generations.
It really does feel like a pivotal moment, like things could go in so many different directions.
Absolutely. It's a real turning point.
And it makes you think about what it all means for everyday people, for our listeners. Like, why should they care about these power shifts and the tragedy of that downed plane?
It's a good question, and I think it shows how interconnected the world really is. Like, what happens in Ukraine doesn't just stay in Ukraine.
It ripples out.
Exactly. It has the potential to impact everything, from global trade and energy prices, even to the political climate right here at home.
Right. It's not just some far-off conflict that doesn't touch us.
Not at all. And of course, we can't forget the human cost, the actual people affected by this war. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical stuff, but real lives are being shattered.
You shared that article about how millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. It's hard to grasp the scale of the suffering.
Absolutely. Behind every headline, every political move, there are countless stories of loss, of trying to rebuild lives that have been torn apart by the conflict.
It's important to remember that.
For sure. So we've looked at these shifting power dynamics, the US, Russia, Europe. We've dug into that downed plane incident and the lack of transparency. But what are your final thoughts for our listeners as they try to make sense of all this?
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It really is. This deep dive has shown how important it is to stay informed, to be engaged with what's happening. It's easy to feel overwhelmed with all the information out there, but it's crucial to dig deeper, to question what you're being told, to look for different perspective.
Don't just take things at face value.
Right, because the future of Ukraine and maybe even the whole global order, it's being decided right now. And it's up to each of us to be part of these conversations, to push for a more informed and just world.
Well said. We've definitely given our listeners a lot to think about today. This deep dive, it's been a journey through shifting power dynamics, international relations, and the very real human cost of conflict. But this is just the beginning, right?
Definitely.
If you're interested in what we've talked about, we encourage you to dig into the source material, keep exploring, and maybe even continue this conversation in your own way, with your own thoughts and insights.
It's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
It really does. It feels like we're at this crossroads, and the decisions being made now, they'll have these huge ripple effects.
No doubt about it. It's a pivotal time.
And it makes you think about what it means for, regular people, for the folks listening to us. Like, why should they care about these power struggles and the tragedy of that plane crash?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. And I think, honestly, it highlights how interconnected the world is these days. What happens in Ukraine, it doesn't just stay there.
Right. It has a wider impact.
For sure. It can affect everything from global trade and energy prices to even the political climate here at home.
It's not just some isolated event. It has these far-reaching consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the human cost, the people whose lives are being turned upside down by this war. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical analysis, but we got to remember that real people are suffering.
You shared that article about the millions of Ukrainians who've been displaced. It's hard to wrap your head around the scale of it all.
Absolutely. Every headline, every political maneuver, there are countless stories of loss and resilience behind them, people trying to rebuild their lives after having everything ripped away.
It's a powerful reminder.
It is. So we've talked about these shifting power dynamics, the U.S., Russia, Europe. We dove into that downed plane incident and the lack of transparency surrounding it. All really heavy stuff.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
It is. But as we wrap up, what are your final thoughts for our listeners as they try to make sense of all of this?
What should they take away from all of this?
I think this deep dive has really, really shown how crucial it is to stay informed, to be engaged with what's happening in the world. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the constant flood of information, but we can't just tune it out.
Right. We got to stay engaged.
Exactly. We have to dig deeper, question the narratives that are being presented to us, seek out different perspectives, because the future of Ukraine and maybe even the world order as we know it is being decided right now.
It's happening as we speak.
And it's up to each of us to be part of these conversations, to work towards a more informed and just world. It's on us.
Very well said. We've given everyone a lot to chew on today, for sure. This deep dive has taken us through these shifting power dynamics, international relations, and the very human cost of war. But it's just a starting point.
Definitely just the beginning.
If you're intrigued by what we've talked about, we encourage you to go deeper, explore the source material, and even keep the conversation going in your own way. Reflect on it, share your insights, whatever feels right.
It's a conversation worth having, for sure.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.